This is Duke University.
Okay, folks, if we can get settled, we'll start.
Oh, really?
Jeff Bauer and
Yeah.
some of his colleagues are out at one of our operations sites in Nebraska today.
Oh, fabulous.
So thank you. I appreciate everyone taking time. We have an interesting day planned. I noticed that there's a healthy distance between the medical device panel and the pharma panel. We're going to try to narrow that gap a bit and see if we can start to broach the issue of how device and pharma relate or fail to relate. Let's start off. My name is Barry Myers. I'm a professor in biomedical engineering, the business school, and orthopedic surgery. I run a biomechanics research facility, but I also run 2 seed funds where we invest in early stage technology from Duke and help move it into the marketplace in the form of licenses and new ventures. I also teach over here a course called Invention to Application, where we take technology from the tech transfer office and screen it, filter it, find the winners, and move those into the market. So if you're interested in that, let me know and we'll follow up. So we'll begin. I'll have our panelists introduce themselves to you. My goal is to say very little and perhaps have them say quite a lot, but also have you ask the kinds of questions that you're interested in, because while I have many questions I'd like to ask and hear about, I suspect they're perhaps only interesting to me. I will share one other piece of my background, which is I've been an executive in residence at Pappas Ventures for the last 5.5 years, and so have a bit of a small company venture perspective, which will round out our panel, which is quite deep in industry. So with that, Jill.
Okay. Hi, I'm Jill Raggio. I currently work for Teleflex Medical. I am in a position that's somewhat of a liaison between marketing and a sales role, and my focus is in cardiac surgery. So I think that's about it. In my history, I've worked for a diagnostic company in marketing, and I was in a sales role for Ethicon Inc.
And I'm Liz Zabel. I'm with Ethicon Endosurgery, not to be confused with Ethicon, one of the 300 different Johnson & Johnson companies. I lead our global bariatrics division, so bariatric surgery for obesity, and I'm very focused on advocating for increased access to care for the obese population.
I'm Josh Horvath. I'm with Becton Dickinson and Company in their diabetes care group. My particular area of focus is actually product development, so developing new products and taking them to launch. So everything from looking at customer needs to developing a manufacturing process and putting a product out in the market. My current area of focus right now is developing insulin delivery devices.
We share a lot in common, I think, in the panel. I'm Matt Kirshner. I work for Medtronic Diabetes. I'm the director responsible for our next generation insulin pump design and commercialization group. So we're focused on insulin pumps. I work closely with our continuous glucose monitoring group as well. I did work for Ethicon Inc. right out of undergrad prior to coming to Duke in 2003. So last time I was in front of this audience was as O-Team lead for orientation. So it's been a while.
Great. So let's open the discussion and try to get a perspective on, for example, we have a lot of students. Some of them may aspire to be in the medtech industry. And given the current state of affairs, regulatory reimbursement, the environment that we're in, and the challenges that you're seeing coming down the road, would you advise them to do that or perhaps consider almost anything else? That's not a point of view, by the way. That was just a joke.
It's complex. I think that the change, from my perspective, I spent time right out of business school working at Amgen in biotech, and was a consultant for a while as well in biotech and med device, and so I've been on both sides. And I think that in either side of the fence, whether you're in pharma or in med device, you've got a really strong regulatory constraint and evolving regulatory environment, which I think makes the need for clinical data and outcomes data heavily tied to payers. I think you look at the 3 panel groups today, and it's representative, I think, of the challenges that we all face, not only just getting products developed, but also approved and ultimately reimbursed. So it's a wonderfully intellectually stimulating place. Can be challenging at times to get things done.
I think one of the biggest needs out there is to create from an in-house perspective is a value proposition. I think that's one of the missing links between, from a financial and reimbursement point of view, because there's so much pushback from the end user, from my side, from the surgeon, where they're so cost conscious these days, and that is very much a big part of what industry needs to lead the path on what is the value proposition your product brings to your end user. And I think that's a missing link that we're trying. Industry is really moving with that to figure it's not just about cost, but it's creating the whole story, and whether that's through clinical data or whatever avenue it is, I think that's a big need out there.
Yeah, I think the medical device industry has been able historically to make just small incremental upgrades or changes to their products, and I think that that's not the way of the future. You're going to have to make significant change in your product portfolio if you're going to get approval from the FDA and if you're going to get payment with the payer. So that's, again, that goes to the challenge and the need for very bright, creative, talented people to enter the industry.
I would agree with that as well, but one of the things that we see with any new device we develop, the first question from the insurers is always about cost. I mean, you can demonstrate something of an improvement over an existing device, but if there's not a very strong health economic analysis to back it up and say, this is what difference it's going to make to the patient, this is what difference it'll make to the healthcare system, they're not interested in incremental improvements anymore, as you said. And as a result, BD has been known for many years for things like syringes and injection devices. Half of our business comes from diagnostic devices and some of the cell counting and sorting instruments, which are enabling even more powerful therapies. I think that's really where the future lies in this industry. It's not the simple devices, but the really complicated things that can make a big impact.
So is this a growth industry? Lots of opportunity?
Unfortunately, in diabetes it is. I mean, it's an epidemic.
You saw an hour. Diabetes is big. I think it's growth, but I don't know. I think that there's the shift that you're talking about, incremental to major changes. I think that change is going to take some time for, I think, the business to adjust to, because you really have to, in some cases, radically adjust your product development process, your time leading up to clinical submissions, how you handle the FDA. I mean, there's a lot of things that before were so rapid. You know, when I was here, it was always the talk of, well, in pharma, you take this, 15 years to build a brand, you got all this patent protection and devices. It's like every 6 months we're launching something. And you just don't see that cycle time anymore. I think so the growth's there, but I think it's more sustained and probably maybe not as steeply pitched.
So let's contextualize this with devices, maybe going from what I'll argue is easy to hard. Diabetes, bariatrics, cardiac. And you can disagree with that order if you like. Who's going to win in diabetes? Is the future the insulin pump? Is it drug depot? Is it implantable devices with 3-month life cycles? What are your thoughts? I'll even make it easier.
You're in the middle.
Is it a device?
He's the one developing.
Or is it a drug?
It's probably a combination of both, but I think the question is, how can you drop the price to a level where all the people who have the need can be treated? The U.S. is really a small part of that international market. And if you think about places like China, where now I think the current estimate is 100 million people affected with diabetes, revised within the past year from maybe 50 million. So, I mean, this is a huge problem. And the therapies that we use in the U.S. are not easily adaptable just because of the pricing. So I think the winner is the person who's able to come up with either the drug or the device combination that enables that therapy for the largest possible number of people. Unless, of course, you can solve the obesity epidemic in another way.
Yeah, I think the obesity epidemic is obviously the driver of the diabetes type 2 epidemic. And we're really, at Ethicon Endosurgery, we are really looking to find less invasive, less costly ways to help patients who suffer from morbid obesity. You think about today, in the U.S., there's over 25 million people who are morbidly obese and qualify for bariatric surgery, and less than 1% ever get the surgery. And the reason for that is because the stigma of and the prejudice against the obese population is alive and well. It's alive and well around the world. It's alive and well at the FDA. Whether or not we develop new medical devices or surgical techniques to help stem this epidemic, or whether or not we partner with our pharma group, it's all about how do we come up with the right solutions to treat these people. While I totally agree, we need prevention. When you think about 30, 40 years ago, there was a whole stop smoking campaign for teens. Don't smoke. Did that work? Absolutely not. What worked is when we had the smoking cessation products that came out to treat the parents of the teens. If you're a smoker, if you grow up in a smoking home, you're going to be a smoker. If you grow up in an obese home, you're more likely to be obese. So we're really focused on advocating for the treatment for the obese population so that you can implement those prevention strategies and get them to work. So I think tackling obesity is the hugest opportunity and issue that we have today.
So perhaps what I'm hearing is that the failure of the public health model to intervene in almost any disease historically through education is a business opportunity in medtech.
Certainly, I think the one maybe just to tack on that last question just a tiny bit, there is a difference between certainly type 1 and type 2 diabetes. And I think when you look at the insulin pump business, for example, our core business, if you will, or the core patients we serve are type 1 patients, and typically you don't have morbidly obese patients who are type 1. I think when you look at the epidemic, which is the type 2 diabetes, you're starting to see a lot more insulin-taking type 2 patients who tend to be a lot more insulin resistant. And I think that solution, ultimately, if it isn't through managing your weight better, reducing less calories, as Hank talked about, ultimately comes to probably some solution of device and drug. Certainly the innovation of insulins and analogs and long-acting insulin have really changed, I think, people's ability to manage their diabetes with less conscious thinking throughout the day, which allows people to live their lives as they lived them before having to deal with diabetes. It's quite fascinating when you sit in focus groups and you listen to a type 1 patient and a type 2 patient. You can't cut them really that way. They actually attitudinally don't cut that way. But if you were to group them really in big paintbrushes, oversimplistically, type 2s basically don't want to know they have diabetes, and type 1s are very familiar with the fact they have it. They were given it. It was either a gift or a sentence or whatever you want to perceive it as, but they deal with it every day. And those basic core attitudes really drive the way they treat their diabetes. And I think that's the hard part with the obesity half of it, which is the type 2 piece, because you really are talking with someone who has to have a behavior change in addition to a drug or device component.
So in that regard, the type 1s are, if you will, pumpable because they're motivated, whereas the type 2s you'd rather put in a 3-month implant and come back and take it out?
I think with type 2s you have, you certainly have to have a less invasive or less cumbersome approach to I think, offering a type 2 patient a solution. But I don't necessarily think that implantable, it's a huge, there's a lot of ground to cover between an external pump that infuses through a tube and an internal pump that you're either refilling or taking in and out. I mean, there's all types of reimbursement implications and technical challenges, obviously, that result with that. But certainly I think the pieces that you'll see to come together are monitoring and infusing, and then ultimately the connection of the two, which helps a sort of semi-automated pancreas or simulate a pancreas externally.
So certainly with insulin-related implantable devices, that's a pretty high-tech affair for all the reasons you've just described. On the other hand, there are sort of first-line drugs for type 2s that can be pumped passively in late-stage trials. So that's sort of interesting. Liz, you brokered one of my favorite topics, which relates specifically to the position of the FDA, obesity drug, obesity device. What's the situation and what are we going to do about it?
What are we going to do about it? That's the big question. Well, I think the current situation is that unlike other therapeutic categories, obesity doesn't have a panel of experts at the FDA. They kind of put together, take a cardiologist, they take an endocrinologist, whenever a drug comes to market, these people who really don't know that much about obesity and who have their own stigmas make the drug manufacturer pass much higher hurdles in terms of safety and efficacy versus a hypertensive drug that might be up for approval because they think, well, it's obesity and it really should be managed with diet and exercise. And the reality is, particularly for the patient who's morbidly obese, they have less than a 5% chance of ever managing their weight. Their metabolism has changed when you're morbidly obese. Your energy expenditure, it's been clinically proven that you do not expend as much energy. So those people their set point has been changed. So I do think that one of the things that needs to happen is we need to work with organizations like the Obesity Society, institutions, whether it's Mass General, Duke, wherever, where we can educate and make sure that we have the knowledgeable people in the FDA that truly understand the disease of obesity so that they can weigh the risk-benefit ratio a little bit more fairly and with deeper understanding. I think the biggest issue with obesity, the biggest reason why we don't treat it and the biggest reason why it keeps growing is a lack of education. People become obese probably a lot because they grew up in an obese home, but they don't have the knowledge, right, to make the right choices. Then the healthcare community doesn't, when you go to medical school, you don't get a lot of training on how to treat obesity. The FDA just took off one of the drugs that was available, one of the 2 last drugs that were available recently. So there aren't a lot of pharmacological interventions. And then healthcare, reimbursement companies, again, really control how much surgery is available for the morbidly obese. So education, I think, across the board from understanding obesity as a disease and educating all the way through to the FDA so that you have the right clinicians and the right profile of people reviewing those types of interventions so that that risk-benefit ratio does get the proper look.
And you contextualize that with drugs. Do you have a point of view on devices?
So I think it's different. I don't think that, I still think there's a high hurdle. It's a little bit different because in my world, when you think about devices for weight management, right, you're looking at a gastric band or you're looking at surgical equipment to do bariatric surgery. So the same endo cutter I use to do bariatric surgery, I might use in a thoracic case. I mean, so it's they don't have necessarily the impact on whether a device gets approved. It's a little bit different scenario. It's more on the reimbursement side.
So that's evolving existing technology to traditional or recent forms of bariatric surgery. Does anyone have a point of view with regard to new technologies, restrictive devices, malabsorptive devices, devices placed endoscopically, minimally invasive staples?
Well, I think it's not exactly an answer to your question, but there are the patients in the sequence that you presented where you have the obese, the diabetic, and then that leads to cardiac, and there's a whole big population of patients that are entering. I think it's about 65% of type 2 diabetics they have some sort of cardiac disease. And when we look in the world of cardiac surgery, this just changes the way that a surgeon has to approach a patient, the way in which, and the length of time his procedure takes and the amount of time and care the patient demands from a cardiologist on both ends of that surgery. So I think there's specific med devices for treating obesity and diabetes, there's also the trickle down of the other diseases that these patients will ultimately get because of their diabetes as a result of their obesity. So there's that whole opportunity, I guess it's an opportunity, as a result of the obesity epidemic.
But specifically to, are we going to get some of these new products approved? I was at the Cleveland Clinic. They just had their innovation summit on obesity, diabetes, and the metabolic crisis, and there's a lot of venture capitalists there, and there is a lot of struggle. The bar is high for some of those implantable sleeves to help reduce absorption. They are being held to incredibly high standards. Again, if it's just to treat obesity, then it better be 99.999% safe, because really there's diet and exercise. When diet and exercise, as I said, only works 5% of the time. So I go back to the opportunity is to educate, frankly, the world about obesity, its causes, what treatments are there, and all the way up through to the FDA, from the consumer to the provider to the payer to the government policy.
So you hit on what I think is a key issue. There are a variety of companies, Barasense, I think it's Cetigen, which have novel devices that are really standing in front of the FDA and choosing, I think, to look to places like Canada and Europe and other markets to try to deploy their technology. I'll give the audience a warning. I'm going to start asking them for questions in one more question, so now's the time to start thinking. Josh, you mentioned something interesting, which is we frequently think of the developing world in the context of low-cost innovation, and certainly there is a large segment that is low cost. On the other hand, if you take the Roche perspective, China will have 200 to 300 million people which can buy their premium pharmaceuticals. And I wonder, from an industry perspective, do we have that point of view that it's low cost for emerging markets, or is it low cost and high cost? Because that segment in, for example, China and India is as large as our entire population.
I think it's both. I mean, you have even 0.1% of a billion people is still a pretty large market. But if you want to reach the broadest possible group of patients, in order to treat an epidemic like diabetes, you can't just focus on the top, because those patients are reasonably well served by the things that are available on the open market today, because they can pay cash and the insurance reimbursement is not really an issue.
I certainly think, the opportunity when we look at all emerging markets, you can certainly characterize, maybe Latin America in a slightly different lens than, certainly in China and India. There are a large population of people who can afford therapy today, assuming they had access to it, assuming clinicians were trained on it, and assuming product is available. And I think that component, I think, is something that we can do directly, and we're from a Medtronic perspective, keenly interested in those markets. The solution for how do you handle the markets where really cost of entry is important, really, I don't think personally is solved by products that we have available launching into those markets. It's actually the creation of lower cost solutions that may in fact not even be, like in our case, the right product for a less a poorer or a country where there's less infrastructure to deliver it. May not even be an insulin pump. It could be some type of insulin delivery device that isn't a pump. But that type of thinking, I think, is from a business perspective, we have a large population we can serve with existing products. How do we best access them? And then I think you get a level deeper, and you say, okay, how do I get to that other patient population? And at this point, it's not that's a pretty significant nut to crack, because there's a development aspect. There's doing lots of local research to figure out what's going to be a solution for that market. So both exist.
So do you believe your companies are actually looking out into the developing world with two markets in mind, or do you have a discrete point of view?
I think they are. I think they're looking at low-cost options where that's a viable solution in certain countries, and then also being able to take some of the higher-end products that we may have in existence already and market those appropriately in other countries. So I think it's both. It's both. Just depends.
And again, it goes back to segmenting your market, understanding who you're going after. There's always going to be a place for high-end. but there is an emerging opportunity for low end. And when I say low end, obviously we mean effective but lower cost options. I mean, we're developing at Ethicon Endosurgery, we're working with thought leaders around the world to develop a new procedure called laparoscopic greater curvature plication, which is actually a procedure that if we are successful in developing this, it will be cost anywhere from $7,500 to $10,000. Bariatric surgery today in the US is $25,000. Ethicon Endosurgery will make less money, but at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do, because if we can provide less invasive, less costly options, more people will get treated. So it's both.
Great. Questions from the audience?
So what is the best strategy to develop devices for emerging markets? Is it like having a development center out there in India and China which caters and identifies the local needs and develop devices for them? Or is it exporting devices from the US to India? Which strategy works?
I think there's lots of ways to do it. I think that there's certainly a benefit of putting engineers and researchers closer to where the markets are, and I think you'll probably see that. I mean, certainly as we begin to invest, I think more in Asia, you'll see R&D facilities probably pop up and things like that that'll help drive that. I think that regardless of where the development happens, the thing you need to have is the local insight and knowledge to understand how healthcare is administered, what specifically the patient needs are, what are the access constraints, how do people pay for product, and those are all very local things, which if you have that, I mean, you could theoretically develop it anywhere. But I think what we're seeing from the diabetes business is we have to spend, I think, a lot more time in those markets, understanding those needs at a very intimate level to be able to come back and actually develop the products.
And I think outside of R&D, it also comes, R&D can be done anywhere. I think then it becomes your cost to manufacture and where that actually takes place, because that adds a huge, the cost of just all the taxes that are associated with where something is manufactured and where it's ultimately used, that can sometimes prohibit your entry to market in certain countries.
Right, but the strategies, as Matthew said earlier, really you need those consumer insights or those healthcare provider insights, understanding that market. So most global organizations do have people in all of the markets, and as we do, and I think all these companies do.
In fact, you can't really, you can go to Europe for a few weeks and get a lot of good data on customer needs and the markets as they are today, but in places like China and India, you can't do that. You can't go for a couple of weeks. It's not useful. And what we're seeing more and more is we'll send teams of people over for 4 months, 6 months, 12 months to live locally and pursue those sorts of activities and find it to be much more effective.
Consider about the you said the low price and the premium price you were charging in the emerging markets. How really different the quality or the effective between the low price and the high price? Is there any quantitative analysis about this?
We, at least from speaking from Medtronic, I don't think we've really pursued in the diabetes space really a two-tiered approach. What happens currently without what happens currently in the markets are in the emerging markets at least is older models of products that are very effective get marketed in those geographies, and the newer products get marketed in geographies where we can get reimbursement, or potentially we have tenders in a lot of European countries. You'll see dual tenders where you have price points you have to hit. I think that what you're asking is if we were to go develop a specific product for an emerging market, I think we would obviously aim to make sure that it's minimally effective. Absolutely, I think on the device side, oftentimes it's features that drive a minimally effective product to a premium product, and the question is at a clinical level, how important are those features? Patient safety is near and dear to Medtronic's heart, certainly to BD and J&J's heart. So I don't think you're ever going to see a product that isn't going to be effective at what it's intended to do. I think what you'll see is potentially features that might make it a little bit easier to use, or maybe it's a little bit easier for a physician to implement or implant or whatever it might be. But I don't think the effectiveness is where you're going to see, safety and efficacy, or those are table stakes. You can't do anything without that.
I have the next question over here. Hi. Sorry, I'm hiding in the corner. I know we talked a lot about different components of obesity today, family dynamics and different cultural trends. How strong do you think the neuroscience component plays into the epidemic as well, that eating food becomes an addiction? And is there anything you did as med device companies to try to partner with pharmaceutical companies to find a dual solution? Just curious your thoughts in that space.
Yep. We are, at Ethicon Endosurgery, we sponsor, we call it the MARS project. It's our metabolic applied research strategy. It's really all about understanding the changes in metabolics and energy expenditure and how does that relate to obesity. We also partner with our pharma organization to understand what are all the various elements. Obesity is definitely, it's a behavioral problem just as it is a physiological problem. I was saying earlier at breakfast this morning that people have the stigma that, boy, if you just diet and exercise, you wouldn't have that problem. Just as 30, 40 years ago, we thought if you were an alcoholic, you were a bum. Just change it, stop drinking, what's your problem? Well, today we know there's a physiological addiction component to it, so now it's more socially acceptable to be able to be treated. Same with depression. So we are definitely, we're spending tens of millions of dollars to understand the behavioral, the psychological, and the physiological component of obesity. A good example is you're born with two different kinds of adipose tissue. You got white and you got brown. And the more brown adipose tissue they have, the higher your energy expenditure. And it tends to, as you get older, babies have a lot, and then as your cells produce, as a percent, your brown adipose tissue is less. But frankly, if you stimulate your brown adipose tissue, we're doing experiments to understand, you actually increase your energy expenditure. So we're thinking of, could we combine brown adipose stimulation with either a drug therapy or a gastric band to actually improve the overall weight loss. So we're looking across all the areas to see how can we come up with new solutions.
So I'll give a jaded point of view just to stir the pot a bit, and I'm not actually saying it's right or wrong, but if we look at an effective surgical intervention and either existing lap band technology or some of the emerging technologies that are variations on restrictive devices, or even combinations of restrictive and absorptive devices, you would declare victory if you got, say, somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% excess weight loss on somebody with a body mass index of, say, 40, and you got that maybe half the time. That's a win. The agency would approve it, everyone would be happy, bariatric surgeons would use it, particularly if the technology allowed them to do the procedure, whereas previously it hadn't. For example, if the endoscopist can start placing this and build up a clinic, they would be very successful. If we think about the obesity epidemic and look at those numbers, half the people who get a procedure lose somewhere between a quarter and half of their excess body weight. You really have done it, from a societal standpoint, not a whole heck of a lot.
I would strongly disagree with that because people who
this is what I've been waiting for the whole
achieve
time.
Any clinician will tell you that people who achieve a 10% weight loss can help manage. It can resolve some of their comorbidities, whether it's joint pain, diabetes. But I'll also say that gastric bypass surgery, you're probably well aware that 80% of the time you have gastric bypass surgery, not only do you lose over 50% of your excess weight, but within a week of getting off the table, your type 2 diabetes is in remission. So we're actually in India, because of that patient population, they may only be 20 pounds overweight, 30 pounds, but they're all developing type 2 diabetes. They're now doing surgery in India, gastric bypass surgery, to drive diabetes into remission. So, the people that are morbidly obese have so many comorbidities that getting 40%, 50% excess weight loss is significant and life-changing for them. And contrary to a lot of a lot of people, the biggest loser people will say, oh, well, 80% of the time they gain their weight back. No, 20% of the time they gain their weight back. So if you have an intervention that is 80% effective, 80% of the time they lose 50% of their excess weight loss versus diet and exercise, which is 5. Well, as a doctor, how would you treat your patient?
So I don't want to debate the numbers. I've seen less favorable numbers, but let's take that as a given. We still have a situation where, from a societal standpoint, we have a big problem, even with the success. On an individual basis, certainly you can have individuals who have all the positive benefits that they get, but are we going to advocate this kind of surgery across the board for a segment of the population? So we can agree to disagree on the extent of the societal versus individual benefit. I think the place I wanted to take that to the question is, if we look at smoking, we had no smoking campaigns forever, and they really aren't effective. Public health educational programs are distinguished for the extent to which they fail, not for the extent to which they succeed. One could argue, for example, that HIV/AIDS was one of the most successful campaigns. It was huge and had some success and some drift after that. And yet, at some point, smoking became unfashionable, and all of a sudden, smoking's down. And I don't understand what drives that change. But at some, if we go back 10 or 15 years, we had very skinny models, and all the young people were emulating that. And I don't know the societal shifts that cause that to change, but something fundamentally has to change where people are incented because of society's view to shift behavior, recognizing that a certain portion of the population is certainly organic, and it's not for lack of trying.
I think that, how did smoking, if we're going to look at that, that was years of advocating for treatment, effective treatment, and prevention and education. So I think when you think about where did the shift come, it's when all of a sudden industry got behind and developed, the nicotine patch and other things that actually helped patients and parents stop smoking. So then, again, their behavior is influencing others around them. So as you, over time, are able to offer safer and effective treatments, and you remove the stigma from getting treatment and put that stigma more on keeping people from starting smoking, right? So making it unfashionable. It's the same with, eating right. It definitely, prevention and health, those are all really important things, but if you don't treat the population today, you're never going to receive that benefit. When you think of a societal benefit, Dr. Pierre Cremeau, a health economist, just published an article that talked about, bariatric surgery. You actually, as a society, you get your money back at 2.6 years. Now, if you have cancer, you never get your money back from that treatment. But for bariatric surgery, within 2.5 years, because of reduction of medications, reduction of hospitalizations, joint replacements, you actually save the society money. After 2.5 years, you're actually making money. So I think that there's a definite societal benefit to treating obesity. And bariatric surgery is only for those people that are morbidly obese with multiple comorbidities. It's absolutely not for people that have a BMI of 33. I mean, that's crazy, right? But the reality is today, people that qualify and have multiple comorbidities aren't getting treated, and the biggest reason is a lack of education and understanding about the relative safety and efficacy of bariatric surgery. Some people think, bariatric surgery, it kills 10% of people. Well, no, it's actually 4 times safer than having a lap chole. Than having your gallbladder removed. It's instead of 0.4%, it's 0.1%. So it's pretty safe. It's incredibly effective for a subset of population. So I don't know why we wouldn't want to treat something that has an efficacy rate of 80% versus just keep saying, do what you're doing.
So what is the reimbursement currently for these procedures?
In the U.S., there's about 60 to 70% of health plans provide, but they also provide reimbursement. but there's a kind of a lot of hurdles you have to go over. Sometimes you have to get a rider insurance. Sometimes you have to go through 6 months of supervised weight loss. You have to prove, some plans say you have to prove that you've been obese for 5 years. Well, who becomes obese overnight? Nobody becomes obese overnight. People that are morbidly obese, over 100 pounds, have been obese most of their life usually. So they put these hurdles in place, which affects the ability for a lot of folks to get insurance. And then there's still a significant portion where it's not covered.
Great. Other questions?
Question. So you touched.
You're live. Go ahead.
Okay. You touched a little bit on the balance between prevention and treatment and the integration of two so that it's most cost effective and also most effective in terms of implementation. I just wanted to get your ideas on, I think one of the biggest flaws in the prevention method is that people expect immediate results, whereas prevention should be actually implemented on a more long-term basis. And because of this, it is also important to pour in resources and money into the treatment sector. But if too much focus is given to the treatment, I feel like it'll take away focus from a more sustainable and potentially more low-cost prevention method. So I just want to get your ideas and thoughts about how to balance the prevention and treatment strategies.
So I'll jump on that for a minute. Our society's view of prevention is quite odd. We are delighted to have a level 4 trauma center available to get you a new liver after you get racked in your car, but we don't do a lot for automotive safety. Several years ago, we became interested in injury prevention. We egregiously underfund it. For mysterious reasons, people now care intensely how many airbags are in their motor vehicle, despite the fact that airbag efficacy approaches 0 compared to other activities. We are a very strange bunch when it comes to prevention. The other thing to think about with prevention, and I think this speaks to some of the ideas that were brought up in the earlier talk, is this notion of risk homeostasis. So I give you a safer bit of technology, or I give you the opportunity to consume better food, you're going to use that and say, well, I did have salad, so where's the dessert? And that's a bit tongue-in-cheek, but in fact we see that all the time. And in no better place than in sports where we generate better body armor, we call it equipment, and the consumer uses it to hit with their heads all the harder. So prevention is a big challenge. It's grossly underfunded. Compared to treatment, and it's a long-term challenge, as you suggest.
One of the things on the hospital side, if you are walking in to have your gastric bypass consult or for your diabetic treatment, as you walk to the elevator bank, and probably 75% of the hospitals, you're walking past McDonald's in the lobby of the hospital. So it's your ability to prevent this epidemic. It's tough because the patients are confronted with it at the very source of the treatment almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no doubt that both prevention and treatment are incredibly important, and prevention is always underfunded, but prevention a lot of times, to your point, doesn't work that well, and so I think you need to think about what's the continuum of care. What are we doing from a prevention standpoint all the way to how are we treating the 400-pound patient with type 2 diabetes and cardiac disease? How do we treat that whole patient? How do we intervene in the beginning? And how do we provide safe and effective treatments? Because I firmly believe that and obesity is an area that it has the least amount of treatment dollars being spent on it, frankly, of any disease, that if you don't have those safe and effective treatments, you're not going to prevent enough to stem it. I mean, the only way to do it would be just to eradicate the population, right? And just kill them all, and then maybe you can work on prevention and you don't have the need for treatment.
So moving on.
I do think that changes, the only comment I was going to make is globally, I think one of you've sort of nicely described, I think, the U.S. I think culturally, we're a population of people who are all about self-actualization and individual pursuit of something. And I think when you start talking about other countries where there's a lot more social wholeness and social awareness, the dynamic changes. We applaud the fact that in our U.S. health system, we may have the very, very best of the best, and that being able to get to the best of the best requires you to have connections, money, or something else. But the reality is we're sort of that very bipolar approach, whereas if you go to a country in Europe that has a social healthcare system, it's a very different sense of, well, if I'm healthier or I help my neighbor be healthier, we're all healthier, which is a very different philosophy to try to, and as a device company, you have to be able to solve for all those different markets and how individuals in those countries feel about healthcare. I mean, it's amazing. I talk to my Swiss friends. We have an office in Switzerland, and it's so wonderfully Swiss. They're like, well, of course I would separate my garbage into 14 different containers and personally take my trash to the trash station and personally dump each container into its appropriate receptacle. I mean, it would be socially egregious to not do that. And it's like, well, in America, I'm glad we have a blue one and a black one, and a green one for like yard trash. So it's a wonderfully complex place to try to solve, being the world, try to solve for different cultures and societies and how healthcare is administered. And you've got a product, in some cases, that's the same product used in all these different places, and you have to find a way to balance it.
So we have a few more minutes. I'm going to change the topic a little bit. Let's talk about innovation. And is it in drug depots? Is it in drug delivery? Is it in drugs? Is it in bifurcation stents? Is it a great way to figure out how to get drug-eluting stents out? Is it in imaging? Where's the future? What excites you and your companies in this space broadly?
I guess for us, we're a little bit on the other side. We're treating these. We are treating a result of the comorbidity. So I think what excites us are creating solutions that that increase efficiency for the end user, and that's what excites us, to be able to provide a solution that is a value-based solution for both the end user and for the hospital. Because without looking at both of those parties, it's no longer just about what makes a surgeon happy or what makes a physician happy. It has to be beneficial for the purchasing agent, which is the hospital. And so I think we're trying to find solutions that meet both of those needs and bring those to market. And that's what, for us, that's the direction that we look at.
But innovation, and I can think broadly of J&J, or I can just think of Ethicon Endosurgery, because we know of the hurdles that we have with managing. Obviously, we make endoscopic equipment for all procedures, right? Thoracic, colorectal. But in terms of obesity, innovation is going to be around finding less invasive, less costly treatments. For example, gastric plication versus having gastric bypass, where you don't have any, you have less incisions. You could do it endoscopically so that you have no incisions, right? You go in just like you have an endoscope, and all of a sudden they're going to suture up the inside of your stomach, and all of a sudden you have a restrictive procedure that can help a lot of people. So it's focused on, and we're really trying to understand, and that's the wonderful thing and the opportunity with obesity and diabetes, is there's so much unknown space of what's driving this metabolic disease, that as we invest a lot of money in research and understanding that better, I think there's a huge hope for innovation and developing things that we're not even thinking of today, because we don't know of that whole metabolic effect, whether it's bile acids, ghrelin, what are all the things I talked to you about, the brown adipose tissue. You might be able to put a little stimulator on your back and be able to lose 10% of your excess weight. So we're looking at all of it, and there's just, in a way, nothing but opportunity.
What I see at BD is looking at ways to address these problems sooner. So you see that a lot in our diagnostics business, things like screening patients when they come into the hospital for MRSA and other things that can lead to hospital-acquired infections. finding low-cost ways to screen large volumes of people for diseases like diabetes. I think that's where we may be able to help if we can solve the problem before it develops into the more serious problem with complications.
So on a plane ride over, I was reading the journal, and Steve Jobs and Google and the Adobe guy, I always forget his name, we're talking about like what's the value of the Android and open platform and all their different positions. And Steve Jobs' approach, I think, is actually, I will put us sort of in there, is the value of your iPhone, I have one, I'm an iPhone user, is integration. And at the end of the day, what people want is seamless integration. And if you look at, from a diabetes perspective, at least the ability to monitor your blood sugar and deliver insulin, potentially delivering other drugs, Similan, Byetta, or whatever it might be. But if you think about that as how we manage our diabetes today, or in the future, I think what we believe that innovation to come from is actually the integration between monitoring and delivery, and ultimately providing people with the data to make informed decisions and to educate. So, currently we have a product that it's the only sensor augmented pump available in the market, which means you actually can have a continuous glucose monitor, which monitors your blood sugar, 288 times a day. You get a reading. It delivers insulin. Outside the U.S., we have a product that would actually shut off if your insulin dropped too low as a result of that sensor reading. And what you're going to see, and those are all tied to an IT infrastructure, which ultimately is going to provide the brains to make the pump function smarter or to read the sensor better, and then ultimately provide the reports to let the HCP and the patient understand, oh, when I had that piece of pizza or those 4 pieces of pizza, what happened to my blood sugar? Well, my blood sugar went crazy. And so I think you're going to see that integration, and what's going to happen is those all things converge, and you start to see integrated products, things like the artificial pancreas, which the JDRF and other organizations, and certainly Medtronic is on a quest to do. But that's where I think ultimately the value is going to come from, because any one, similar to what Hank talked about, it's not one ingredient that's going to probably do it to you. It's the fact that you're eating too many of all of them. And I think from a care perspective, you have to have those things integrated to make it optimal. So I think that's what you'll see from us.
Great. Well, so we started off the conversation with a question of perspective on medical device and its future. And I think what you can see now is that, in fact, there's a very interesting future. There are huge untapped markets that are underserved. I think the challenge in what you're hearing in the different elements of the presenters is the way in which they're underserved. The barriers to moving forward aren't as simple as they used to be. In the good old days, one simply innovated and took money from one group of physicians, gave it to another. They got very excited, adopted very quickly, and suddenly you had a business model. The stent is perhaps the best example of that. Today, barriers are more nuanced. The limits to adoption of surgery are societal. They are reimbursement issues. They're regulatory issues. And there's delivery issues, both in this country and in others. So it's actually, in fact, while perhaps one could easily argue a challenging market, capital markets are a mess, unemployment is high, this is actually a pretty interesting time to go out and step out into the world. So with that, I'd like to thank our panelists for an engaging discussion and you for your patience.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.